John Moore first fought terrorism in 1967. He is still fighting it today. Walking patrol in Vietnam at night, alone, he searched for terrorist booby traps, researched for terrorist bombs in his Jeep, and saw what happened to those who did not find out. John flew 57 combat missions over Vietnam, many of those being hit by enemy gunfire. John went on to then join the Green Berets at Fort Bragg, where he trained to invade the Middle East. He also did classified studies of Middle East terrorists for the Special Forces. Special operations, covert operations, surveillance operations, bodyguard for executives and stars like Charlton Heston, Jane Fonda, and Ambassador Alan Keyes. As a private investigator and a homicide detective, a candidate for U.S. Congress, he's a radio talk show host and author of books on personal security. John still finds time to be a husband, a father, and a grandfather. Today, John will speak on the second most important story in 2,000 years. The Gulf Stream has stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome John Moore.
Thank you, Greg. Y'all want to stand up and stretch a little bit? You've been sitting down quite a while. Do you want to take a little stretch? Just get the kinks out a little bit? Go ahead and do that. How many here were here for Bill Federer's presentation last night? Quite a few? Okay. Bill Federer has been my friend since 1998 when he first ran for Congress. I ran in the 96 cycle, the 3rd Congressional District, Dick Gephardt's district. My campaign was national news for one day. One day. That was the day the FBI found my credit report in Dick Gephardt's file cabinet. Bill Federer had his chance at fame also when one of Dick Gephardt's young interns assaulted him. And that assault against Bill ended up with him being charged with ordinance violation assault, which is not even a misdemeanor. And I was part of the defense team to help defend him, and we eventually went to a jury trial. Now, ordinance violation assault is the equivalent of a parking ticket. It's not even a misdemeanor. What a hoot. We had depositions. We had a stack of depositions, transcripts about a foot tall. About a $30,000 defense for something that would amount to a traffic ticket if he'd been convicted. But of course we won, and nobody had ever seen anything before or since like that. I want to take you all back to the year 2000. I was approached by a couple of friends of mine, researchers. In the spring of 2000, they told me about this matter. Neither one knew the other was studying it. And they said, John, there's this thing called the 10th planet, Planet X. And when it comes through our solar system, it causes these problems. It causes these 200-mile-an-hour winds, earthquakes, volcanoes, bizarre weather-related events. And I thought, these guys really need tinfoil hats. What a strange, strange story. But I respected these men enough that I approached another friend of mine who, shall we say, works for the lettered agencies. I told him the story, and then he told me I needed a tinfoil hat real bad. But he respected me enough to go ahead and check it out. He gets back with me about a month later. He says, John, it's exactly what you said it is. The government's known about this since 1979, and they've been preparing for it since 1979. I said, really? He says, yeah, really. Well, that's when my research began in earnest. It's been a long road, a rough road. Things were going along pretty good until the summer of 2005 in this research. I happened to be having lunch with a friend of mine I served with in Special Forces, who also was a dual service veteran, U.S. Navy veteran, also U.S. Navy Submarine Corps. During the course of our lunch, I was telling him about the 10th planet, and he starts telling me about a classified Navy briefing that he was at in 1985. This changed everything. At the classified briefing, he was told the following: gentlemen, these oceans are going to come out of their basins in your lifetimes. Not your children's, not your grandchildren's. This is going to happen in your lifetime. And if you want to live someplace safe when you retire, move to the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. Now, since then, I've debriefed about 24 of these Navy veterans who all were at the classified briefings. They all saw the map that's on my DVD. I worked with 3 Navy veterans to recreate the map. The map showing new coastlines for North America: East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, and the Great Lakes region and the Mississippi Valley. It's a pretty scary map. How many people have seen that map? Okay, I know quite a few of you have. It's a pretty scary map. Let's start at Maine, at the Canadian border. The U.S. Navy says, not John Moore, the U.S. Navy says the East Coast will take damage up to the Blue Ridge Parkway. Everything 400 feet above sea level and lower will be underwater. The Blue Ridge Parkway is a very scenic road. It runs north-south on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. Much of it is 100 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. Going down the coast to Florida, most of Florida is going to be gone. The highest point in Florida is 55 feet above sea level, and that's on the mainland, it's not on the isthmus. I've driven past some construction sites in Florida, and you see these backhoes working. It's all sand. I don't know how they build anything down there. I guess if you put piers down deep enough, you eventually hit some rock. Going up the Gulf Coast, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana are going to lose about half their real estate to the oceans. Texas will take damage about 100 miles inland. I do private consultations. I was at a client's house about 100 miles in Texas, 100 miles from the coast. I'm getting out of the truck. I look down and I say, this used to be under the ocean. It's all sand. He's 100 miles from the Gulf Coast. It's very easy in much of Texas, within 100 miles of the Gulf Coast, to find seashells right there on the ground. California, Oregon, Washington will take damage 50 to 100 miles inland. It gets steeper, a little bit quicker on the west coast. The Pacific Northwest, the geologists refer to it as a geological nightmare. I was talking to a man who lives in the Cascade Mountains. I said, you know, sir, those aren't mountains. He says, yeah, I know, John, they're all volcanoes. The Cascade Mountains are not mountains, they're volcanoes, all of them. The Mississippi River Valley, which is not far from here. We got the Missouri River in walking distance. In fact, what was it like here in 1993? Was this underwater?
Most likely.
It backed up? Yeah, I thought it probably did. I see the utility boxes around here 5-6 feet off the ground, and they do that for a reason. Where the Mississippi River joins the Gulf of Mexico will be about where the Arkansas-Louisiana state line is now. That's according to the U.S. Navy. The Mississippi River itself will be 50 to 100 miles wide, 100 feet deep, effectively cutting the United States in two. Anybody hear of the United States Northern Command, U.S. Northcom? Okay, it's about, 7-8 years old now? Beginning about 3 years ago, they started splitting U.S. Northcom east-west at the Mississippi River. They're not telling the senior NCOs or the officers why. They're just saying, split everything, logistics, the men, the equipment, everything, east-west at the Mississippi River. They're doing that for a reason, too, because they have no choice. And it's a lot easier to do it now than it would be at some future date. You don't have bridges across a river 100 miles wide or 50 miles wide. You simply don't do that. Here's some simple Google searches. Almost everybody here, I'm sure, has internet access. These things have been happening right in front of our eyes for 7-8 years now. Here's one Google search, CIA and the word Denver. And you'll find the CIA's press releases that beginning in 2005, they started moving from Langley, Virginia to Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City. Another Google search, NSA and the word Denver. Same thing, press releases going back to 2005, National Security Agency, which we finally call no such agency, moving from Fort Meade, Maryland to Denver, and Fort Meade, Maryland to Utah, and Fort Meade, Maryland to Augusta, Georgia. They're really spreading out. The new capital of the United States will be Denver, Colorado. The backup capital for the eastern side of the country will be Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta is the highest altitude major city east of the Mississippi River. Most of us here have had jobs, or still have jobs. You know, ladies and gentlemen, if you file a grievance against your employer, it's like suing your boss. It's not really career enhancing, right? Are you on the same page with me? Okay. The scientists in the EPA, they filed grievances against their employer saying, gentlemen, when you shut down these 4 libraries, which happened in summer 2008, they shut down all 4 of the EPA libraries. It's the largest English language collection of scientific material on the planet. They shut down all 4 of them. The grievances said, gentlemen, you've cut us off from what we need to keep America safe. The EPA's response was, we did this as a cost-saving measure. Now, if there's one federal agency that's fairly honest, it's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. They came back and said, no, it costs more to shut down these 4 libraries than to keep them open. So where do they go? Well, they're not talking, but I'm pretty sure they went to high ground. They're not going to put that collection at risk. They're simply not going to do it. Now, a few years ago, after 9/11/01, we had this anthrax problem where some nutcase was mailing anthrax to various people, and we all heard about anthrax. The U.S. government has a facility where they study really fun stuff like anthrax and foot and mouth disease. Now, Greg, if you and I were going to do this, would we put it on an island in the Atlantic Ocean? Would that be a smart thing to do, to put the anthrax and the foot and mouth disease when you're going to study it on an island in the Atlantic Ocean? Of course it would, and that's exactly what they did half a century ago. Plum Island, off the coast of New York, in the Atlantic Ocean. You can do a Google search. There's Google search, and there's Google Images, there's Google Video. Go to Google Images. Go to Google Images and put Plum Island in there, and you can see photographs, aerial photographs of Plum Island. It looks like a 200-acre golf course. Now, the publicly stated reason for moving from Plum Island is we've run out of space. You know, these same images show the buildings. You know, 200 acres. I mean, how big is this field here we're sitting in? Is it close to 200 acres? Anybody want to guess? Okay. Well, regardless, you look at the Google image, the satellite photograph of Plum Island, you can see 3 or 4 buildings there and a lot of green space. No, they haven't run out of space, not at all. And where are they moving it to? Where you worked as a state trooper. They're moving the most dangerous thing that you can imagine to the most productive agricultural real estate on the planet, Kansas. That's really smart. That's incredibly smart, isn't it? I've determined to my own satisfaction, ladies and gentlemen, that this is just as real can be. Don't ask me for a date. We'll talk about dating later on. When I was interviewing my friends, the Navy veteran and the other Navy veterans, in the fall of 2005, I started writing a paper. It was published in January 2006. The title of it is No Need for Panic. Anybody here got a copy of it and read it? A few? Okay. No Need for Panic. Published January 2006. In that paper, I state that according to the scientists at the time, the Gulf Stream had lost about 35% of its mass and velocity. And the scientists at the time were estimating 5 to 20 years in the future, it would stop. This one event by itself is going to change everything. This one event by itself will change everything. Let's talk about the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a body of warm water. In fact, Benjamin Franklin named the Gulf Stream. 200 years ago, they thought that all these currents were kind of separate and doing their own thing. It turns out they're all connected. All the streams, all the ocean currents are connected. There's something called the Gulf Loop Current, which is in the Gulf of Mexico. It comes out of the Gulf of Mexico between Cuba and Florida, joins up with the water out of the Caribbean, and starts going north along the coast of Florida, past Georgia, up past South Carolina. It gets to about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and starts going north by northeast. More like east by northeast, excuse me. It used to go all the way up to Long Island before it started going east by northeast. The U.S. Navy, every 24 hours, publishes a brand new map showing the sea surface temperatures of all the oceans on the planet. You go to my website, thelibertyman.com. You can read the article I wrote there, no need for panic. I got the link for the Navy website. I'm working with my local mayor, chief of police, fire chief, head of the paramedics, and some community organizers on preparedness. And the mayor said the other day, John, I don't quite buy that stuff. And I said, well, Mr. Mayor, the United States Navy is not exactly known for black helicopter conspiracy theories, are they? You go to the Navy website and you look yourself. You can see the Gulf Stream coming up, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina. It starts to go east by northeast. And it kind of meanders around and stops a few hundred miles out. It did that on June 12th, 2010. The third week of July this past year, 2010, I was put in contact by one of my research team with Dr. Louisiani Zangari, a PhD scientist working in Italy. He's working with other scientists in North America and in Europe, exclusively on the Gulf Stream these past 11 years. At the time, at the beginning of the third week in July, Dr. Zangari said, we think it may have stopped. We're doing more calculations. It was about 7 or 8 days later he confirmed that, in fact, on June 12th, 2010, the Gulf Stream had stopped. Things started getting really wacky with the weather right after that. Here's a quote from Dr. Zangari. Now, up until I heard this quote, my opinion of the Gulf Stream was pretty similar to most people. I thought the Gulf Stream affected the eastern seaboard of the United States, England, Ireland, Scotland, Western Europe. Most people believe that, didn't have any knowledge of weather. It turned out I was completely wrong. Here's the quote from Dr. Zangari. The Gulf Stream is the pacemaker of the climate of the planet. And here's the reason why. There's something else called the jet stream. 5 miles up from where you're sitting, sir, 5 miles up is wind, 200 miles an hour. It's called the jet stream. It's there all 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The jet stream. The Gulf Stream was a regulating factor for the jet stream. It regulated it, caused the jet stream to move in a predictable fashion. That's very important for agriculture. We're in the middle of a cornfield here. One year it's corn, the next it's soybeans. This is farm country. If you're growing grains, you can have a certain amount of precipitation. You can have a certain, not too high, not too low. You can have certain temperatures, not too high, not too low. Within those parameters, you can grow a really nice crop and have a good yield. You start getting too much precipitation or too little, too high of temperatures or too low, you start losing your yield to the point where diesel fuel costs more than the harvest, and you just let it rot in the field. We're already seeing that. This past fall, 2010, Russia announced publicly that they would not honor grain futures contracts that they'd already sold. You know, ladies and gentlemen, that's not an act of war, but it's about an inch away. That's a very serious international law matter. The Ukraine did the same thing. And quite frankly, it's the right thing to do, is take care of your own people. And they did do the right thing. Grain growing areas planet-wide are at extreme risk right now. This past summer of 2010, Moscow had the hottest summer since they've been keeping records. They've got weather records in Moscow going back 1,000 years. There aren't many places on the planet that have that. You get west of the Mississippi, you rarely find temperature records, weather records going back past the 1880s or 1890s, about 110, 120 years or so. Going east to the East Coast, you find weather records going back a little bit farther. 1,000 years worth of weather records. This past winter, the winter of 2010, 2011, Moscow had the coldest winter in 1,000 years. One extreme to the other. Agriculture, farmers need predictability to be able to make the investment in the seed, in the fertilizer, and the diesel fuel, and all the rest that they need before they put that crop in the ground. They're losing that predictability. North America has been, so far, fairly resilient. We've got the beginning of what might be a Dust Bowl situation down around Oklahoma and western Kansas. That remains to be seen. A friend of mine grows, her family business is growing wheat in western Kansas. The winter wheat crop was at great risk last time I talked to her. They weren't sure they were even going to get a harvest. I teach concealed carry training. That's where I met many of these Navy veterans. My home is down in Crawford County, about a 2-hour drive from here. I do these concealed carry classes about once a month. Every class from August of '08 until January of '09, I had at least one Navy veteran, each one of whom was either at the classified briefing or had been told about it by a buddy in the Navy. Each one of whom moved to the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of what they learned in the classified briefings. One of the men who bought the original edition of my DVD, he was a Navy veteran, is a Navy veteran, living up in Montana. In 1979, he was just a young sailor, stationed in New Orleans, and he gets an assignment to set up a briefing room for a bunch of admirals. The tables, the chairs, the sound system, lights, and so forth. And he sees a map on the wall. He's not in the briefing, he's just a 25-year-old sailor. He's not going to be in there with these admirals. He said, John, when these admirals showed up, and he said, by the way, admirals don't do weekend briefings. He said when the admirals showed up, they're all slapping each other on the back, smoking cigars, how's the wife, how's the kid, making jokes. He said when they left the briefing a few hours later, they all looked like their puppy dogs had died. He said, John, I saw that map in 1979. It's 2009 now. I did not know for 30 years what that map meant until I saw your DVD. Now I know why those men all looked like the puppy dogs had died. They just looked at the end of the world staring me in the face. As you know from hearing my bio, I investigate murders. I investigated my first murder in the fall of 1973. I wrapped up my most recent homicide investigation about a year ago. And Greg, as a defense investigator, when I go looking for a murder suspect, I'm by myself with no backup. No Motorola to call for help. We're having a fundraiser for one of my clients charged with murder, who was innocent, by the way. A real travesty, but I'm not going to go into that story today. Travesty of justice. The sponsoring group was the Western Cherokee Nation. This is in September 2008. September 2008. I see a man walking around. He's got this official-looking ID badge on. It says, Tim Spencer, Director of Preparedness, Western Cherokee Nation. So I introduced myself. Never met this man before in my life. I just got my new DVD from the duplicator just days before. I said, Tim, I got something I need you to look at. So I give him a copy. He gets back with me a week later. And he says, John, I've seen your map. I said, really? He says, yeah. I was in the Navy Submarine Corps. I said, I didn't know that. He says, I was in New Orleans doing classified work for the Navy in 1985, and I saw your map. Well, he and I and his wife, we've become friends since then. They were in one of my pistol classes about a year after that, maybe 8 or 9 months, doesn't matter. His wife's name's Lori, very lovely lady. He and Lori are both from Central Florida, and they're both Cherokee Indians. In fact, Tim was an adult before he knew you couldn't make as much whiskey as you wanted without a license. But that's the way they do things in Central Florida back in the swamp. Anyway, we're having lunch, and his wife Lori says the following to me. She says, John, I don't like cold weather. I don't like snow. I don't even like Missouri. But we're here because of that map. We're here because of that map. When Tim retired from the Navy, they picked the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of the map. That's why they're here. That was 25 years ago. Tim's gone public with me when the rest of these Navy veterans could not. The rest of these Navy veterans have pensions, and they're not going to put their pension at risk to talk to you folks. They're not going to do that. Tim has a different situation. When he reported for his first submarine duty with 2 other men, the captain said, well, gentlemen, we don't have bunks for you. You're going to have to string up hammocks between the nuclear warheads of the Polaris missiles. Don't worry, no radiation. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, all 3 men are being radiated. Tim Spencer suffers from severe radiation poisoning, and he has disability. He does not have a pension. They can't take his disability away from him, so he's agreed to go public with me. And he appears on my DVD with me being interviewed. God bless you, Tim Spencer. With something this important, Greg, you need a live eyewitness. You need a first-hand witness, not some investigator like myself telling you about people I talked to. You need a first-hand witness. It's too important not to have that. And that's what we got finally, live on DVD. The fall of 2005, I met the second submarine veteran. He didn't serve with the U.S. Navy. He was an intelligence officer from another service. I got to protect his identity here. I was doing a speaking engagement down in Rolla, Missouri on the topic of terrorism. The professor is a friend of mine, and so we finished talking to the college students about terrorism, and we go to a local pizza place there in Rolla, Missouri. We're sitting at a 4-top table. The intelligence officer's directly across from me, his wife sitting next to me, and my friend the professor's over here. Once I found out he did a 3-year tour of duty in the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps, I had to ask him the question, because I never met this man before in my life. I may never see him again. I asked him the question, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. Before he can speak up, his wife speaks up. She says, John, our last duty assignment is at the Pentagon. We've lived all over the planet, typical military family. We had to pick a place to retire. We picked the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of rising ocean levels. Well, bingo, I knew I had my second witness. What a homicide detective does is 2 things. Locate witnesses and take statements. That's what we do. That's what we do. We locate witnesses, we take statements. I am very, very good at doing both. So I made a lunch appointment with him the following week to meet him at Steak and Shake and take his statement. He agreed to talk with me, and he was the second man to help me recreate the Navy classified map. The third veteran, he was an officer in the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps, one of my pistol students. I can use his name because he's now passed on to his reward, dying of cancer. Cancer is pretty epidemic among Navy veterans for obvious reasons. They're around way too much radiation, way too long. Steve Canfield was his name. So I met him in his pistol class, and I make a lunch appointment with him for the following week, and we get together, and he says, John, I got a problem. I signed a 5-year non-disclose agreement. I've only been out of the Navy 3 years. If I tell you what I know, it could cost me my pension. I said, okay, Steve, can you blink your eyes once for yes and twice for no? That way you won't be talking to me. And he smiled and said, yeah. And we went ahead and had our conversation. He went ahead and talked to me. And he was the third man to help me revise and recreate the Navy classified map. It's been a long journey, ladies and gentlemen. It's had many twists and turns along the way. I came to find out that another research project, which goes back to the early 1980s, was connected to this. We've all heard of the deep underground military bases, right? Most of us have. It turns out just outside my hometown of St. Louis, they built one of these. A place called Weldon Springs, Missouri. Early in World War II, the U.S. government, Department of Defense, they bought more than 1,000 acres in St. Charles County to build a munitions plant. In the mid to late 1950s, they built a second plant. They took about a 40-acre corner, and they built a separate plant to make nuclear material for the Department of Defense. That was shut down in the late 1960s. In 1979, the Department of Energy announced a Superfund cleanup site to clean up the nuclear waste at that location. I didn't think much of it. They drug in some job trailers. I'm out there training with the Army Special Forces on weekends. No big deal. And then they announced that they were going to shut down the entire 1,000 acres because of radioactive material. That was my first red flag. Myself and the other men I worked with, we were young men that could have children in the future. And to make sure we had children with arms instead of flippers, we brought our own Geiger counters with us. We didn't tell the Army, we didn't ask the Army, we just wanted to be sure we were safe. We never ever found anything above normal background radiation. So that was my red flag there when I began my research, because I knew that was a fabricated story, that there was radiation back there. Over the years, I interviewed and debriefed outside vendors that worked there. I interviewed employees who worked there. I did Freedom of Information Act requests. I took photographs on the ground. I took photographs from the airplanes. It was quite a research project for a lot of years. I heard that there was an inordinate amount of telephone lines going in there. Now, this is a no big deal construction job site. This is all this is. Maybe 8 or 10 construction company job site trailers in there, some administrative personnel. Now, before I tell you the rest of this particular story, you need to know that with modern digital technology, every hardline telephone line, I should say, can be used by 3 users at the same time, at least 3 users at the same time. That's modern digital technology. So I did a FOIA request asking how many phone lines I got coming in there. The answer came back, 500. 500 phone lines. I located and debriefed 3 commercial construction supervisors, job site supervisors. I said, in your 30 or 40-year career, what's the most phone lines at any job site you ever had at the largest commercial construction job site? The answer from all 3 men independently was 50. They'd never been on a construction job site that had more than 50 phone lines. Anybody ever hear me on the radio with Ann Morrison? She's on with me a lot. Yeah. We've got her on a schedule right now for every Friday morning. Ann was a Department of Energy employee working there. She's an engineer, she's a scientist, she's got a couple of degrees under her belt, very bright woman. She had a colored ID badge when she was on the premises. A colored ID badge that would let her go in some parts of the administrative building and prohibited her from other parts of the administrative building. Now, why would you prohibit your own employees from certain parts of a no big deal administrative building for a no big deal construction job site? Why would you do that? Why would you have that kind of compartmentalization? That's what you do when you're trying to keep secrets. And let me assure you, the government is very, very good at keeping secrets. I'll hear people say, well, an outfit as big as the federal government, they can't keep secrets. Excuse me, you ever hear of the Manhattan Project? What was it, 250,000 men and women worked on the Manhattan Project? Including my father and my grandfather down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They were plumbers. My grandfather had certificates allegedly signed by Harry Truman, thanking him for working on the Manhattan Project. He kept it on his garage wall. That's what he thought of that. But, yeah, 250,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project to build atomic weapons. Very, very few had any idea what they were doing. It's called compartmentalization. That's what you do when you want to keep secrets. I've interviewed CIA people who are moving from Langley, Virginia to Denver. They don't have a clue why they're moving. They're told, if you want a job, if you want a pension, pack your bags, get on the road, go to Denver. Compartmentalization, it's very, very effective. Some of the men who have inside knowledge of this, the guys my age in their 50s and the early 60s, they'll say things like, I'm too old to learn how to live all over again. I'm just too old to learn how to live all over again. I know men who have access to these underground facilities that refuse to go there. They don't trust the engineering. They don't want to be there with those folks. They're going to do their own thing, like many of you are doing. So what are we looking at? We're looking at these oceans coming out of their basins. One of the disadvantages I had was the men I was debriefing, these submarine veterans. They were the guys in the folding chairs in the audience, just like you are. They weren't the scientists who knew the inside information. They were just told a little bit about what would happen. They weren't told why. So it was a serious disadvantage that caused me a lot of extra work. So I'm trying to figure out, it took me the better part of a year, where's this water going to come from so quickly? Melting ice, ice can't melt that fast because they're talking about the ocean's coming up in 30 days or less. when it finally gets going. It couldn't be melting ice. The answer is pretty simplistic, and everybody in every geology department and oceanography department in every university knows the answer. They measured sea level at Cornwall, England. They just took a big rock at the edge of the ocean, they put a horizontal line on it, they said this is sea level at Cornwall, England. It's been that way for a couple hundred years. It turns out when you get to the equator and you go 1,000 miles north or 1,000 miles south, there's a bulge of water almost 500 feet above that line on that rock in Cornwall, England, held in place by gravity and the rotation of the Earth. Anything that disrupts the rotation of the Earth more than a couple of degrees is going to disrupt all that water. That's where the water is going to come from. That's where the flooding is going to come from, all these coastal areas in the Mississippi Valley. Let's talk about the Mississippi Valley a little bit. We have something called the New Madrid Seismic Zone. In the period of 1811, 1812, there were hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes during that winter. 3 of them were strong enough to ring church bells near the East Coast. One of them made the Mississippi River run backwards for more than a day. Now, of course, in 1811, 1812, Missouri was not even a state. It was basically some French fur trappers and the Osage Indians. That was about it in Missouri. Illinois had a little more development because it was east of the Mississippi River. The U.S. Navy, not John Moore, the U.S. Navy says that once the weight of that water is pressing down on the New Madrid Seismic Zone, it's going to trigger 3 9-point plus earthquakes. That'll get your attention. Earthquakes have been in the news a lot recently. I see a lot of gray hair out here, at least as gray as mine. And my recollection is up until 5 or 6 years ago, we may hear about 1 earthquake, maybe 2 earthquakes a year, and it would make the national news, right? What is it now? Every week? Every other week? In my paper, No Need for Panic, I said what would happen in the future. Increased number and severity of seismic activity. Increased number and severity of volcanism. Increased number and severity of violent, bizarre, dangerous weather-related events. That's what would happen in the future. That's what I wrote in 2006. Well, the future is here right now. The future is here right now as we speak. What are all the effects? I touched on them briefly, but it's good to know what they are. When the pole shift occurs, and the Navy is pretty certain there's going to be a pole shift, we'll have 200-mile-an-hour winds for anywhere from a day to 2 days. The jet stream is going to come down to the surface of the planet. We're already seeing isolated examples of that. There was a forest in the Czech Republic that was flattened by straight-line winds about 4 or 5 years ago. Here in eastern Missouri, we had straight-line winds knocking down a lot of trees about 4 or 5 years ago. A couple of years ago, on May the 8th, we had a hurricane over land. My friend Ann Morrison, once again, she was at a training session for Skywarn. It's a government program that teaches plain old civilians to accurately look at weather and accurately write down what they're seeing and report back to the county sheriff's department what they're observing, Skywarn. So she's had a Skywarn training class in St. Louis County, about 4 or 5 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. During a break, this young scientist, a young NOAA scientist, young enough to be her son, out in the hallway on a break, he says the following: just wait until you start seeing these hurricanes forming over land. And of course, Ann Morrison already knew enough to ask a follow-up question. The young man instantly knew that if he answered the follow-up question, that his career and his pension would be on the line, and he ignored the question. He wasn't about to go there and put his pension and his career on the line. On my DVD, I have the image of the first hurricane over land. It was over Oklahoma a few years ago. One we had here a couple of years ago, even the local FM radio station in my neighborhood was calling it a hurricane. What's a Category 1 hurricane? It has to have counterclockwise winds, a well-formed eye, and sustained winds above 75 miles an hour. That's a Category 1 hurricane. And that's exactly what we had moving across southern Missouri. We had the equivalent of 1 year timber harvest on the ground in a couple of hours. You drive down through the Ozarks right now, you'll see thousands of trees just lying flat on the ground. There's more timber that could ever possibly be harvested before it rots. A hurricane over land. You know, if you were in school to be a meteorologist and you told your instructor that such a thing could happen, you're going to fail weather school. You know? At least if you told them that 4 or 5 years ago, you'd fail weather school and not get your degree as a meteorologist. Traditional meteorology says hurricanes, their energy comes from warm water. Obviously there's no warm water in the Ozarks, not that kind of warm water anyway. My friend Professor McCanning understands weather better than most. If you're not a student of Professor McCanning like I am, I urge you to become a student of Professor McCanning. Get his books, listen to his lectures. He has a 1-hour radio lecture every week. University level information in a format that most anybody can understand. He says the nature of hurricanes is they're electrical in nature. That's where they get their power. They get their power from electricity in the air. It turns out that all lightning is a concentration of the electrical energy that's up there all the time anyway. That's all it is. Fascinating stuff, and Professor McCanning is the man to go to when you want the scientific answers. The U.S. Navy designated not only the Arkansas-Missouri Ozarks, but also the border area of Montana and Wyoming as a designated safe area. Way too close to Yellowstone to suit me, but if you want to go there, go there. You know, and deal with Yellowstone. Nothing we can do to stop this. We can mitigate it by doing what we can. Let's come back to the Gulf Stream a little bit. One of the problems in dealing with this is when you start talking about a 10th planet in science and astronomy, people's eyes kind of glaze over. And they want to hear about an authority. They want to hear credentials. You start talking about looking at stars, they want to hear about credentials. I was looking for a man with impeccable credentials that could talk about the 10th planet, and I finally found him. And he made a permanent record on video. Now, Greg, if you're going to draw a paycheck for looking at stars, how is this for credentials? Supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory. You think there's any more upward mobility in that career path? Hardly. You're at the top of the heap. If you're the supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory, your career is about as high as it's ever going to go. Dr. Robert Harrington, supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory. He was interviewed in his office at the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. by Zachariah Sitchin in the late 1980s. In that interview, I hope I don't trip over this wire. In that interview, he talks about the 10th planet as a matter of scientific fact, not scientific speculation. He talks about its size, 3 to 5 times the size of Earth. He says that it has a far larger iron-nickel core, giving a lot more bang for the buck in terms of its effect on our planet, the other planets in our sun. And then he draws its orbit, which is just about the exact same orbit that Zachariah Sitchin found from studying the 5,000-year-old Babylonian clay tablets. Just about the exact same orbit. A few weeks after that interview, Dr. Harrington stated that he was going to pack up equipment, go to the Antarctic, and look at this thing himself. Now you see this man on this video, you see a man, maybe in his late 40s, early 50s, a healthy, vigorous, strong man. A few weeks after he made that announcement, he was dead, allegedly from a fast-acting form of cancer. I say allegedly. His obituary, very strange obituary. I've never seen an obituary quite like this. His obituary, which I'm sure was written by a government official, said, Dr. Harrington, near the end of his career, had given up his search for the 10th planet. His top research assistant never said anything publicly about the 10th planet again. He got the memo. He got the memo loud and clear. My friend John DiNardo likes to republish frequently the New York Times newspaper article about the 10th planet from the early 1980s, written by one of the New York Times science editors. He publishes that and distributes it quite freely and quite readily. One of the things about scientists is they spend most of their lives doing not very fun things, and when they discover something really, really important, they're very proud of what they've done, and they want to share that knowledge with as many people as possible. So what happened in that period of time was these scientists were really happy and pleased with what they found, and they went public with press releases before the NASA top officials could get them shut down. But thank goodness this New York Times science editor got a hold of it and published it, so it's a permanent record in the New York Times of the scientific realness, the scientific fact of the 10th planet. Now that the Gulf Stream has stopped, I don't need to talk so much about the 10th planet anymore. My boss, John Statmiller, really doesn't like to hear about it. He tolerates it. He really doesn't want to hear about it. John's a very tolerant man in a lot of ways. But now that the Gulf Stream has stopped, I really don't need to spend too much time talking about the 10th planet. Now I've got verifiable scientific evidence that anybody with internet access can go and look at this at the Navy website. Anybody pay attention to what was happening in the winter in England, Ireland, and Scotland? Oh my goodness. People in Ireland standing in line to get fresh water because their pipes were frozen. The pipes under the ground were frozen. Now in this area, we bury the pipes, about 18 inches deep to deal with cold weather. A lot of their pipes in Ireland weren't even buried at all. They'd come up out of the ground on the outside of the house and go in about 3 feet high. That's why you build homes in Key West. They're not used to serious winter in Ireland, so they don't bury the pipes deep enough. They ran out of what they call grit before the end of December. By the end of the first or second week of winter, which winter begins, of course, December 21st, they ran out of salt and sand or whatever they put down the roads out there because of unprecedented snowfall and ice. Now, Greg, if you're going to build an airport like Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, you're going to get the best engineers, you're going to get the best architects that money can buy, right? I mean, it's a really big deal to build a multi-million-dollar major airport. And if you think it's ever maybe even could snow, you know, you're going to take care of engineering for a snow load. Of course you are. You know what? It never snowed in Paris before this winter. They had snow in Paris that caused them to nearly shut down part of the airport because they thought the roof was going to collapse from the snow load. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay. My friend, the college professor, I gave him my paper in Late for Panic. He read it. He gets back with me. He says, John, is it more than these 23 pages? And I said, well, Sandy, how about the 5,000 pages in the bibliography? This presentation in the short form is normally 3 hours. I got 50 minutes, and now I got 5 minutes left. I'm going to encourage you to get a copy of my DVD. I'll be back there signing copies for you. We also have discount tickets for the Expo Preparedness in Springfield next month. You need to educate yourself. You need to figure out what this means for you and your loved ones. So many different things for different people. The evidence is real. The evidence is verifiable. And once you verify it for yourself, it's far too important to take the word of a homicide detective for something that's important. You need to check it out yourself. Verify that the evidence I'm presenting is real. Now, I've done trial preparation for a number of very serious matters for a lot of years, and my lawyer friends who watch this, they recognize trial preparation when they see it. I present the evidence, you're the jury. That's my job. I bring the evidence to the table. Your job is to evaluate the evidence and determine if it's real or not real. Since it's verifiable and real, of course you can come to no other conclusion. Then you're left with a quandary. What do you do? What do you do? I work with private consultation clients on this all the time. hopefully the husband and wife will be on the same page. Frequently, one or the other thinks this is something they really don't want to expend family resources on, time and money. Hopefully both spouses will be together and they can reach a conclusion as to seeking a safe haven for the people they care about. Making sure there's food, potable water, a way to grow food, medical supplies, and people get training. I encourage people to get training on what you need in a safe haven. The skills are mostly commonly found on farms and ranches all over the country. Dozens of skills. The two skills that are not so common are ham radio skills and emergency medical treatment skills. Those are the skills that are in short supply and in very high demand. In fact, working with my mayor, chief of police, and the fire chief, we went to some trouble to identify the ham radio operators in our community and everybody who at some time, currently or in the past, has had any kind of emergency medical skills. We're doing it countywide also. Any kind of emergency, short-term or long-term, you want to identify and know who those people are and have them on your team. How do you find your local ham radio club? Go to your local Radio Shack, talk to the manager. Ham radio people are in there all the time getting the bits and pieces that they need. Go to the FCC website. Go to the ham radio section. Every ham radio operator in the country is listed by zip code. Frequently, your local fire department will give emergency medical treatment training, local junior college, sometimes a hospital. There's lots of ways to get emergency medical skills. Get those skills now while you can. Get the equipment. Get the supplies now while you can. I got a couple of minutes left, Greg. I'll repeat what I said earlier. Gentlemen, this will happen in your lifetimes, not your children's, not your grandchildren's. This will happen in your lifetimes. These Navy veterans aren't worried about the timing. They know they're ready. They've got the training, they got the supplies, and it's far better to be 1 year too early than 1 day too late. I'll be back at the table after this, and I thank you all very much for your time.